I would like to invite you on the virtual stage. Pass the mic to you.
Thank you, Peter. Great to meet you. Evelyn, great to meet you. Marcus, Marco, Martin. Just a quick comment, Evelyn, this whole notion of the humanities and looking at knowledge for humanity, it's very interesting in that there's been some interesting writing just the last couple of weeks about the importance of compassion in political leadership and compassion in just coming to terms with the innovation that is going to be needed in this corona recovery, because we're moving towards recovery, and what is going to be needed. I know there's been a lot of visibility around the excellence of the leadership of New Zealand, small country, 80 million sheep, 5 million people.
And 4-day week.
Jacinda Ardern has really been somebody that has changed the way that people are thinking of leadership and compassion in leadership. I don't know whether the Cancellier of Oostenrijk is showing the same kind of thing, although as the youngest global leader in the world, maybe even younger than the female Prime Minister of Finland, he should be thinking about compassion in leadership. But the reason, Evelyn, I want to just make mention of what you'd said about knowledge for humanity. DLD had a session last week that was fascinating by a guy by the name of Brian Eno. Brian Eno is a well-known music producer, but thinker. And if you can pull up that talk, he was interviewed by Hans Ulrich Obrist, who is the head of the director of a very important art gallery in the UK. And Brian Eno had some incredible views about the future and thinking about how innovation needs to be thought about in a slightly different way, because yes, innovation has always got to be about developing new ways of doing things. And yes, technology is the driver in the modern world, but really the driver of what stimulates people to breed a better sense of compassion is something that I think is going to be needed in this recovery process. If you look at, Marcus, what you've said about what you've been doing in education, particularly interested in the whole notion of the development of soft skills with students. My business partner in one of the big education objectives that we are working on is a woman by the name of Esther Wojcicki. Esther has just recently came out with a book called How to Raise Successful People. You spell her last name W-O-J-C-I-C-K-I, Esther Wojcicki. Esther is an iconic educator who started out as a journalist, then did a degree at the University of California in Berkeley, and then married and moved onto the campus of Stanford University, where she's been living for the last 40 years. She's the mother of 3 daughters, Susan, who runs YouTube worldwide, Anne Wojcicki, who originally was married to Sergey Brin, one of the founders of Google, and Anne created 23andMe, probably the world's most important genealogical platform. And she has the 3rd daughter, Janet, who is a very gifted epidemiologist and a polyglot. How many of you know what a polyglot is? A polyglot is someone that can speak more than 7 languages. And Janet speaks 9 languages, including Japanese, Zulu, Xhosa, of course, all the European languages. And this family, and Esther, is really, her book, How to Raise Successful People, is a distillation of the teaching that she did for the last 39 years at the biggest high school in Silicon Valley, where she taught Steve Jobs' kids. She taught the kids of most of the senior Silicon Valley innovators and executives. And the interesting thing about Esther is her teaching mechanism, and Marcus, what you had said touched something in my thinking about this, is that developing soft skills for kids, or getting kids to learn about what the truth is in journalism and stories and people's lives and belief systems, particularly in an age where we are having to be so much more careful about the kind of information or news, even that you might see, for example, with Viktor Orban in Hungary, where he is manipulating a lot of issues around news, and somewhat doing so the same with teaching and public perception. But Esther's whole belief is developing independence with her students, and independence of thinking and critical thinking. And here's an interesting story. Her oldest daughter, Susan, actually was living in a house in Palo Alto, and she rented out her garage 22 years ago to two young postgraduate students from Stanford, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. She charged them $1,700 a month to rent the garage for their new company, and they had just finished doing their PhDs, which was supervised by a brilliant Indian mathematician who had qualified in India at one of the Indian IITs, the Indian Institute of Technology. If you are a student in India, one of the hardest schools to get into is an IIT, where just getting in, the competition to get in is so high. This mathematician decided to move to Silicon Valley. He was the person who supervised the PhD thesis of Sergey Brin and Larry Page. And they always said that he was responsible for helping them understand the algorithm for search, which would form the basis of what Google was to become. So they rented the garage of Susan Wojcicki, and Esther Wojcicki was very involved in spending time with Susan and talking to Sergey Brin and Larry Page about the kind of structure they might want to think about to have in a company that they were looking to form, to take advantage of finding a way to search the world's information. So Susan then became hired as the first female employee of Google. She was actually the 16th employee, but the first woman. And she was the one who came up with this idea to use what Google called AdWords. This is the Google technology linked into their algorithm that would enable Google to sell advertising and show how advertising could be found to get to your core target audience.
Do you know which year that was?
That would have been, well, she rented the garage 22 years ago, and so she probably came up with AdWords and AdSense, as they also called it, about 17 years ago. So she was the person within Google that recommended that they speak to a guy called Chad Hurley, who was one of the two founders of YouTube. And YouTube at the time was an interesting idea, lo-fi TV, not hi-fi, not Wi-Fi. Well, it was Wi-Fi in its early form, but Chad Hurley had come up with this idea, and Susan took this idea to Larry Page and to Sergey Brin and said, look, the world is changing. People are going to want personalized TV. This is not going to be pro-Sieben, as it is in Germany and Austria. This is something that is going to be a personalized way that will be much more relevant to people in the digital world. And Google then spent, I believe the number was around $1.3 or $1.4 billion to buy YouTube. And of course, today the value of YouTube as a business for Google is close to $200 billion. So Susan running YouTube, I mean, it's just interesting. Susan has been responsible for really taking YouTube and broadening its appeal. And Marcus, one of the interesting reasons that I mentioned the YouTube story to you in the background to what Susan does and Esther does. Esther was the person who came up with the idea for Google that Google employees should have 20% of their time for their own personal use. Are you all familiar with that system within Google?
Mm. It's not active anymore like this, but yes, it's how they started.
If you're an employee of Google, you can say, well, 80% of my time, I will do everything that I need to do in my job at Google.
And today it's 20% of your time to something else within Google.
Correct. So for example, Gmail came about because some Google people were doing that in their 20% free time. But Esther was the person that came up with the idea and suggested to Larry and Sergey, saying, listen, you've got to stimulate the creativity of your employees. And if you give them an opportunity to do something that they see as their own independent creativity, and Marcus, what you'd said about 95% of the 100 or so kids that you, or 100,000 you said, no?
Yeah.
When you do that kind of thing, I know, for example, a very, very distinguished, one of the great leaders on Wall Street is a guy called Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio has got probably one of the most valuable hedge fund businesses in the world. And he is very big on teaching his employees soft skills, particularly meditation. And you think, meditation, Wall Street, America, in the Donald Trump era? How can that possibly work? But soft skills and the ability to use creativity and the ability to get your imagination and to be an Imagineer as well as a Visioneer. So visioneering, Imagineering. Look, Disney decided to call one of their most important companies in Disney Imagineering, because that's what they do. Walt Disney was one of the first Imagineers. Yes, he invented Mickey Mouse, but more importantly, when they developed Disneyland, do you know that one of the phrases they used to describe Disneyland, which is still used today, is Walt Disney said to his executives, what do we do to be able to create the happiest place on earth? The happiest place on earth. How can you do that? And that really was one of the strap lines in all of the Disney advertising when Disneyland was first started. And of course, just 2 weeks ago, Disneyland in China, in Shanghai, just reopened after the corona virus closed everything down. But the whole idea of Imagineering and doing that in education and with kids is really so important. So Marco, when you spoke about your moonshot pirates and personal development and exponential thinking, I think we're very fortunate to be living in an era where exponential thinking, Imagineering thinking, where the whole world of innovation, if you can think of something interesting and something interesting to do, there probably has never been a better time in humanity for coming up with an idea that might sound absolutely ridiculous, but nonetheless that could get some belief early on and could be developed into something interesting. I always remember when the founders of Airbnb came up with the idea of renting private property, people's personal residences, apartments, so forth. First of all, what was the background of the 4 founders of Airbnb? Mostly, they were design students at the Rhode Island School of Design in the state of Rhode Island in the United States. Small state near Maine in the northeast of the US. But the Rhode Island School of Design has traditionally always come up with very interesting designers. And Brian Chesky, one of the key founders of Airbnb, always had the view that if you are coming up with a new idea, and the idea was, would we be able to make people's private homes available to rent? What is more important than the idea of renting private property, how can we design the design that would explain what Airbnb could be. First of all, to users, but also, as importantly, to people who had property. When this first came about, the first thing that people who had property that were approached by Airbnb said, what? Rent out my personal property with all of my clothes in it, my books in it, my hi-fi, all of my property? How do I do that? And they pointed out that there was a system that combined technology, design, utilization, also trust, because they would have to have some mechanism that they would have to design for people that would not respect what the rental relationship or the rental contract would be. And so it's interesting in today's crisis area where, of course, the hospitality industry, hotel industry is going through the worst crisis actually ever in the history of hospitality and the hotel industry. And Airbnb having to try and borrow $2 billion just to keep the structure going. They've had to cancel their IPO on Wall Street. They can't go public for the moment at any rate. But they've had to use Imagineering to pivot into thinking what they can do to change the thinking about Airbnb. But just getting back to how Airbnb got invented, it got invented because Brian Chesky and his three partners wanted to try and have a whole new way of imagining how you could rent out people's property and make it as attractive as if you went to one of the great hotels in the world. Let's say, for example, you went to, say, Ritz-Carlton or something of that level, but something that people would find that would be affordable and would spread the word that Airbnb was something useful. So, Martin, I was so pleased to hear that you're from Corinthia. I've always heard that people from Corinthia are amongst the smartest and hardest working in Austria. I know a couple of people, one of whom recently was the head of all of digital for the Minister of Digital in Austria. And he was one of the original founders of the Pioneers event in Austria that also has been responsible for developing a lot of startups in Austria.
Andreas Chas is the name.
Chas?
Andreas Chas.
And Jürgen Florian were the two people that founded it. And they really had a great idea to begin with and really stimulated, of course, together with another great supporter of innovation in Austria by the name of Hansi Hansmann. Hansi was an older guy who started out with a pharmaceutical company. He had a laboratory actually in Spain that made a lot of pharmaceuticals, and he decided to get involved in investing in the startup scene in Austria. And one of the big successes he had was a company from Linz in Austria called Runtastic, which was bought by Adidas. And the founders now, after the sale, they still work for Runtastic, but I'm sure that they've bought a big villa maybe in Italy or in the south of France or wherever it might be, successful as some other great innovators. Just yesterday, I was having a discussion with Ilkka Panainen. Does anyone know that name? Does anyone of you play video games? Any of you esports gamers? So you're familiar with a company called Supercell? Ilkka Panainen is an incredible Finnish guy. He sold 51% of his company, Supercell, to SoftBank for $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion for 51%. But some of the games that they had, I don't think they have Clash of Clans, Nikki. I think they've got Casino Royale is one of their big games. Is that the name of the game?
I think it's Clash of Clans. Let me double check.
Clash of Clans. But, you know, this all comes down to innovating, somewhat thinking out of the box. The other guy I was speaking to yesterday, Ilkka Panainen, is a wonderful guy by the name of Riccardo Zacconi. And Riccardo is famous in games and esports and mobile games because he was the guy that came up with the idea for Candy Crush. Candy Crush. Can you imagine that? He had no money. He was desperate, but he believed that if he could develop an incredible mobile game that would have great, great appeal for women, because the statistics showed that 45% of all mobile gamers were women. Evelyn, do you play mobile games? Evelyn, you don't. Oh my God, you're missing out.
I missed my chance. I can start to.
Try and play the game PUBG, P-U-B-G, PUBG, very good game. But anyway, the reason I mentioned some of these names and just thinking about what you've been saying, and Peter, do you live in Copenhagen? You do. Okay. So there's an incredible Danish guy who divides his time between Copenhagen and New York, and he styles himself as an education engineer. I'll get his name for you in a minute, but he is somebody who has pioneered a whole new way of teaching education. He is someone who has an alliance with Esther Wojcicki, but he believed that in the same way as you get an electrical engineer, mechanical engineer, civil engineer, why not an education engineer? And after all, Denmark, even though it is small, Denmark has always been a culture that has always shown that design is a very important part of creative thinking. You must always stimulate design, because after all, if you can stimulate innovation, you can stimulate design, you can stimulate creativity, and you can stimulate a knowledge for humanity, as Evelyn is doing. These are the key elements that breed new ideas and stimulation. I was reading just a couple of weeks ago when it was announced that the king and queen of rock and roll, did you know who they were, the king and queen of rock and roll? Had just died. The king and queen of rock and roll was Little Richard.
Oh, yeah.
Why was he the king and the queen?
I don't know.
Well, first of all, he had a lot of confusion about his sexuality. He didn't know whether he knew that he was a man, but he always had a strong feminine instinct. But when one was reading his obituary about his life, when he started out, he was one of 11 children or 12 children, and he'd always liked dressing up in his mother's clothes, but he also liked to sing in the church. And his father could never understand why he sometimes had a feminine side to his personality, and his father kicked him out of the house. But he was always somebody who believed that with his high voice and the way that he could go both on the feminine and the male divide, and sexually he was a gay man at a time when it was very difficult to be that, but he was a real original in his time, because he would imagine what it might be like to be somebody that there never was. He was unique in the same way that, say, Prince was unique, or for Austrians, what was the name of that gentleman who entered the Eurovision Song Contest with the last name of Wurst? Mm-hmm. Conchita Wurst. Oh, yeah. So when people first saw Conchita Wurst, they thought, my God, what is this? But meanwhile, that was his identity. I mean, I've never seen a Wurst with a beard before. I don't know about you. Not Wurst, no. Conchita Wurst. But anyway, the reason I'm saying all of these things, giving you all of these examples really, is the whole notion of developing innovation and creativity, but particularly creativity. Here's an interesting story. How many of you have ever heard of a guy that became famous as the world's leading lateral thinker? That's thinking out of the box, by the name of Edward de Bono.
I know him.
Marcus, you familiar with him? Marco, Have you heard of him?
Yeah.
I haven't.
Okay. Evelyn, have you ever heard of Edward de Bono? D-E, next word, Bono, B-O-N-O, like Bono?
Putting all the links to the wiki pages of these people into the chat, so you can also now we'll share the chat with you later on. This is this is an encyclopedia conversation that we're having now.
Okay, but Martin, the reason I mentioned Edward de Bono, I want to give you an example of the way that he would use out-of-the-box thinking coming out of creativity. So who is Edward de Bono? Edward de Bono is now, I think, in his early 80s, getting on. He was born in Malta. He studied to become a doctor, and then he kept on believing that there must be an original creative way of thinking. And he developed and wrote some books about creative thinking and thinking in a way that was just a new way of thinking, where there may be rules about thinking, but what happens if you create the rules yourself? And he would become an advisor to companies, to professionals, to engineers, to maybe come up with a new way of thinking. So here's a small example of one of the ways that Edward de Bono came up with thinking out of the box. He was hired by a small city council in a small town in Australia, and they'd heard about him and his out-of-the-box thinking, and they didn't think that they could afford to get Edward de Bono to be a consultant to the small town. But they said, let's ask him if he can help us with a problem we are having in this small Australian town. So what was the problem? The problem was this. The town had one main street. And in this main street, what would happen is when people came to the town, a lot of the farmers on the sheep farms, or in Australia, they call them sheep stations, came to the town to do their shopping of the vegetables and groceries and food. What they would do is they'd park in the main street, and they'd park there for maybe 2 hours or 3 hours. And the problem was for the mayor of this small town that if these people were coming in and were parking in the town on this one main street for all that amount of time, it would not allow many more people to come in to the town to shop. So they said to Edward de Bono, Mr. de Bono, can you help us work out an interesting way where we can get more people to come and park? We don't have money to install parking meters. We don't have the internet where people can pay for their parking on their phone. Can you come up with a suggestion? And he thought about it for a couple of days, and then he called up the mayor and he said, I've got a very good solution to your problem that won't cost you any money other than you painting maybe 10 signs, street signs, that have got a new rule that is particularly for your town. The mayor said, oh, that's a great idea. What is it? He said, what I want you to do is, I want you to make a sign that says, if you park in the main street, you can only park in the main street if you leave your headlights on. Leave your headlights on? Why would that be even acceptable? Anyway, they put up the signs, and it became the rule in this particular town that once you parked your car in this main street, you had to put your headlights on. Now, of course, everybody knows with modern motor cars, if you have your headlights on for 10 hours, your battery will not run out. Maybe after 20 hours, something like that. But the point is, psychologically, by just getting people to put their headlights on when they park, people would generally tend to only park for between 35 and 60 minutes. And it changed the complexion and the shopping procedure in this small town. So that's Edward de Bono came up with hundreds of examples of out-of-the-box thinking. But I always love that example because if you think of something that is simple, out of the box, unusual, creative, solved a problem, innovation thinking, and how to change something in an interesting way, that is really going to be driving the countries of the future. And even in established countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Denmark, the whole notion of how you stimulate innovation. And what is great to see with all of the incubators and accelerators that are now, all over the world, where we're seeing some incredible things coming out of countries that you just wouldn't expect. Like, for example, I always think, for me, one of the great guiding lights of innovation was, which country in the world do you think was the most responsible for starting payments on people's mobile phone?
M-Pesa?
My guess would be some country in Africa. But
what do you say, Evelyn?
Adam said M-Pesa.
Which country might that be from?
So it's from Vodafone Zone in Silicon Valley, but it's for Kenya.
He says Kenya. Marco, what do you say? Marco, and the love of your life, what do you say?
Oh, my life.
Take a guess. Yeah, I hope it is the love of your life. It is your fiance, no?
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. So,
Love of your life. If you don't say it is, you're in trouble tonight.
no, it's all good.
No idea.
Okay, so any idea, Marco, any country you can think of? Marcus? Martin?
I thought this is Estonia.
Estonia? Suggestion?
I would say a country where it's very hard to move cash around. So, and somewhere ridiculous like Senegal or somewhere where you just have to be able to get money to people and everybody's got a lot of people have got a mobile phone. Yeah, I'd say somewhere like Senegal, or maybe somewhere around there.
So you
And Rob, not to confuse you, my sister has just joined us. So Michaela has just joined us.
Hello, Michaela. Guten Tag. Great to see you. So, okay. So the answer to the question is that it started in Kenya. And the reason it started in Kenya was, and this was, I would say, about 5 years before Apple started allowing Apple Pay, maybe longer. But the reason it started in Kenya was that there was, and there still is actually, the largest telco in Kenya, not Senegal, they don't operate in Senegal as it turns out, so it's East Africa, Kenya, is a company called Safaricom. And Safaricom had a very, very innovative thinking managing director who could never understand why the banks didn't see minutes as money. Now, what does that mean, minutes as money? Well, if you're running a phone company, the more minutes people use means that the more they'll pay for the use of their mobile phone. And he then went to 3 banks in Kenya and said, I've got so many millions of people that have mobile phones with Safaricom, using so many hundreds of millions of minutes every month. Dollars and Kenyan shillings, which is the currency that they have in Kenya. A shilling is a currency. Minutes could be a currency. Can you back minutes and find a way that minutes can be charged because it turns into money? They agreed it, and he came up with the name of M-Pesa, because what M-Pesa means, the word M-mobile, Pesa is money in Swahili, which is the language they speak in East Africa, mainly in Kenya, Tanzania. And M-Pesa started, and it was the first time that people who didn't have any way of storing money, because there's a huge area in the center of Nairobi, a large, they call it a township, nearly 1 million people live in it, where there's a lot of crime. People were worried about keeping money even under their mattress, but they introduced M-Pesa, and it was a way in which people could have money on their phones. It was a technology during the use of 2G, even before 3G. And then, of course, as that developed into 4G and now 5G and gee whiz, all of these things became, that's where M-Pesa started. Bless you, Peter.
Thank you.
This is, it was an innovation thinking by this managing director of Safaricom, who now is working as a rapporteur for the United Nations, trying to help with innovation in emerging markets. So certainly just thinking about, Martin, your Congress that you've been running for 10 years on innovation and the monthly meetings that you have, I'm sure there are people in Corinthia coming up with interesting ideas. I know certainly in different fields, certainly Singularity University and the different ways that they teach or try and expose people to interesting ideas, the whole world of digital health and mobile health. This is an area that's becoming increasingly important. And I think one of the things that you have to tell people that are innovators, if they've got an interesting idea, you must say to them, don't panic, because if you've got a great idea and you can find someone who believes in you, because remember, if Larry Page and Sergey Brin did not have this Indian mathematician that believed in their ideas for an algorithm, that would not have been the development of Google. There's a sad story about that Indian mathematician, because he was really responsible for helping Sergey and Larry define the mathematics that would drive the algorithm. He lived in a big house in Palo Alto, and one morning his wife couldn't find him in their bed next to where she was sleeping, and she got up and couldn't see him in the house, and she went to the back of the house and found that he was lying at the bottom of their swimming pool and he had drowned. It was a great shock. Here was this brilliant, brilliant mathematician. He had already been given a percentage interest of Google. So as Google had started going, he had been very successful. How could this mathematician have drowned in his own swimming pool? What caused it? Well, as a young man growing up in India, he never learned how to swim. And apparently he had got up in the middle of the night, whether he had been drinking the night before, no one really knew, but he fell into the pool. Everyone else was sleeping. He couldn't swim. He drowned. So life has strange twists and turns. So one always, it's like, Eveline, when you're talking about humanity, and we spoke about compassion, and we spoke about the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, the whole notion is we only really, if we're lucky, have 36,000 days. Well, let's work it out. If one can live to be 100 years old, and I was just recently reading, there was a woman in Spain who managed to get rid of the corona virus. She was in ICU. She's 113 years old. So even if you are 100 years old, that's 36,500 days. That's all you got. Do you know how many months that is?
4,000.
1,200 months. Is that 100 years is 1,200?
Yep, yep.
1,200 months. So you think you take a month to go on holiday, you take 60 months to do a university degree, 1,200 months, that's all you got. Boy, the clock is ticking. You mustn't take a licking. You got to make the most of your time and your ideas and associate yourself with people that are stimulating.
And you're sleeping 5,000 months of this.
Sleeping? Nicky, you don't do any sleeping. I know Nicky is someone who's got this incredible ability. He doesn't need much sleep. And there's certain people, just their metabolism allows them not to have to sleep. Now, Marco, I hope you are getting at least some sleep.
So that was very unexpected and incredible. A journey of personal situations and connections that no one else than you can build in that way. As Michi has just joined us, why not extend this format to Michi? Maybe you can briefly introduce yourself to Ralph so he knows who he's talking to. You're muted. You have to unmute yourself. Let me do this for you. No, you have to mute yourself. Unmute.
Yes.
Hello? Now it works.
It works now. I'm Nikki's sister, as he told before, and I'm journalist since over 30 years, and publishing since 1.5 years economic magazine for women, which is called Sheconomy. And yesterday I had Sheconomy, like the female version of economy, Sheconomy. And it's published in Austria as a classical print magazine and online, and also we are also on social media. And yesterday I published my book about how the digital world is changing our everyday life. And my brother's world was an important inspiration for me, because I went with him through the 1 week through the Silicon Valley program, and there have been such interesting places where we got such interesting meetings, and all the experience is you find a lot of experience I got during this week in my book. And I also had a study which I finished 2016, analyzing how the industry cyber-physical systems are changing the everyday's life, everyday's work in workers' life. Yes, for workers, in the producing industry. And I'm very sorry I came so late, but I had a hard night because I was so nervous yesterday when the book was published that I couldn't eat the whole day. And then when it was over, I ate so much and the wrong food, so I didn't have a good night tonight. Yes, that's why I didn't got. It was not possible for me to start from the beginning, but everything I heard now from the last in the last 10 minutes was so exciting. Also this example with M-Pesa, which I was reading some articles already about when I was working for a news magazine, but I forgot it completely, and I think it's also a very important input for me, which I should mention when I talk also about my work, this M-Pesa example. So I talked a lot now.
Kayla, one of the most fascinating innovators and women innovators that I've ever come across. Have you ever heard of a product which was developed in America called Spanx, S-P-A-N-X?
Yes, these are for making a smart figure, a sharp figure.
Exactly correct.
Yes.
I don't know what the German word for a foundation garment is, a corset, but this woman could not get something to make her hips feel a little bit thinner. She became one of the first female billionaires in America by developing this particular kind of product. And there are a number of women that have done incredibly well. Have you ever heard of Juicy Couture?
Yes, yes.
That's another group of women that developed that. And you've heard of Lululemon, of course, which is the fastest growing brand in America this year, believe it or not. But there's another one that started by women called Fabletics, where each month you get a workout clothes, a new one, and it's suddenly taken off. But there are, of course, great women scientists, great women executives. I mean, Sheryl Sandberg obviously is one of the most important people running Facebook, but women innovators, very, very, very important area that must never be neglected. And it's just so great to see that there's much more. There's a group in the UK, that really brings the best women innovators together called Accelerator, not Accelerator, Accelerate Her.
Sure.
Yeah. So in a way, that's like economy,
Yes.
but it's Accelerate Her.
Yes.
Not Accelerator.
I know. I wrote it down because this everything you said now is very, very, very interesting for us for the Economy magazine.
And I posted all the links in the chats, so you can also retrieve it from there.
I see it now. Mm-hmm.
We are doing some incredible work with a woman in Indonesia on our education moonshot project that we're developing with Esther Wojcicki. And this woman is known in Indonesia, which is a big country, 276 million people, largest Muslim country in the world. She's regarded as the mother of the internet because she was the first to develop online, the internet, and all that stuff in Indonesia. It's a big deal. And Indonesia is an interesting country, 14,000 islands.
Mm-hmm.
And she always was fascinated and completely a believer in esports. And she's developed the first ever esports tournament in Indonesia. And we're building an education moonshot talking about exactly the things that Marcus, you had spoken about in your education belief system. Because to develop an education moonshot using Esther's matrix, as she did in her book, How to Raise Successful People, but also to add an element about training, and particularly for project management training. And so this woman is really, she's just an incredible innovator. She thinks out of the box, and she has a company called bubu.com, bubu.com. But I just make mention of it because there are women all over the world who do well. When we were talking about M-Pesa, someone had mentioned Estonia, of course, always known for the development of Skype. But also Estonia's got some very interesting thinkers. And if any of you want to become a digital citizen of Estonia, it only takes you about 25 minutes to do it.
How do we do that?
So if you have a German passport, an Austrian passport, what about an Estonian digital passport?
It's an e-residency.
Yeah.
E-residency, exactly.
And I posted it as well.
That's right. So Michaela, I think, what is the title of your book?
Error 404. It's like the message everyone gets when you put in a wrong email address. Error 404.
Oh, great.
Page not found. That's the title.
Why were you so nervous?
Because I'm not so much, I told Nikki yesterday, I'm not so much used to speak English, and I have to get a little time and something has to change in my head that I speak more fluently.
And it's too early in Austria for a glass of wine, which always accelerates your language processing.
Yes, that's too early, that's true.
Well, I've got good news for you. You're great. You're doing great, and it just takes a little bit of practice. It's no big deal. You'll get very used to it.
Yes.
And the important thing is you did something more difficult and more important than any of us have done. And that is you wrote a book. You finished the writing of a book. That takes a lot.
Yes, that's true. It was quite a hard year, but I'm very happy because I've got a very positive response in the last few days.
Ralph,
make it available in English language?
It's only in German, but it would be great if it would become such a success that it could be probably translated in English, because yes.
Yeah, we should translate it together. That would be fun.
Yes, Nikki could do this. That's true. Yes.
Difficult translation, because a book by a female author like yourself is something that would definitely get interest in the English language countries.
Yes, I think if I can say this from my work, but I think I got a good mixture between my studies, between journalism, and between personal experience. And that's perhaps why it's a little bit different from other books which are coming out to this subject. Most of them are coming from experts, and I'm not an expert. I'm a journalist knowing a lot about the subject, even if I did studies on it, but I wouldn't say that I'm an expert.
Right.
Ralph, we're coming to the end of the hour, and I think that was amazing. It was totally unplanned, very spontaneous, but very helpful and insightful. And I think that sums up the conversations that we're having. You're always connecting dots. You're always adding some history. You always live a yesterday, today, and tomorrow attitude whenever you're in a conversation. I think this is adding so much value because a lot of people are in their todays, a lot of people are in their tomorrows, and way more people are in their yesterdays. And I think combining all the three is a very, very important skill that you always add to the conversation.